Thank you for joining us for this edition of Current Reflections. I'm Bradley Shreve. Today, the Higher Learning Commission and other accrediting bodies see shared governance as a critical element in how institutions of higher education operate, and it is a key factor in granting accreditation. But exactly what does it mean to share governance? For this installment of Current Reflections, we are joined by Dr. Linda Sue Warner, a member of the Comanche Nation and a leading voice in American Indian education for over 5 decades. She began her career teaching elementary school and then high school before earning her PhD in administration at the University of Oklahoma and transitioning to higher education. Although she has held various positions at different institutions, her most indelible mark on the tribal college movement came as president of Haskell Indian Nations University and as a member of Comanche Nation College's governing council. Dr. Warner is editor of the landmark book, Tradition and Culture in the Millennium, Tribal Colleges and Universities, and one of the foremost thinkers on administration and education at TCUs and native serving institutions of higher learning. And so we're honored to have you here today, Dr. Warner, to share your insights and perspectives on shared governance.
Thanks, Bradley. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.
Great. So I believe the last time you joined us for Current Reflections was in 2019. How have you been and what have you been up to lately?
Actually, I work for a fairly small consulting firm, and our primary, we do a lot of technical assistance, but we primarily work on writing grants for Indian organizations and Indian tribes and tribal colleges. And so I've been actually pretty busy. I did some consulting work with a company that just finished in December the Bureau of Indian Education's technology report on all of their schools and their access and teaching, professional development and all of that around online in the COVID era. That was pretty interesting. I have about 23 years of Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education Service, and a person can get pretty cynical during all that time, but listening to people, specifically classroom teachers, and what they were going through and what they were doing for Indian children, also in the whole scheme of things, really made me think that there are still people out there who care about Indian kids and they're actively working to help them. And it was really refreshing. It was a refreshing view to look at Bureau schools, because a lot of people tend to criticize them. But anyway, so just different little projects like that. I'm working with one of the tribal colleges today that's got a technology grant, and that's where I'm at right now. So.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and dive in here to shared governance. And so because of its significance and complexity, TCJ's advisory board voted to make shared governance the theme of our upcoming fall issue. What does shared governance mean in the tribal college context, and how may that differ from mainstream institutions and major accrediting bodies, such as the Higher Learning Commission and Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities?
Well, I think that for me, the primary difference is shared governance in the tribal colleges is really it's really embedded in the culture. It's already something actually that we bring to Higher Learning Commission as opposed to them bringing it to us. So in my experience at Comanche Nation College, for example, probably the best administrative experience I had over the course of my career, because we decided early on that we would do all of our policies and procedures and practices around consensus building. And so as a college council, we worked with the administration and the faculty and the students to build consensus about everything that we did. And so when I went down there and would go to those meetings, because I started on the council when I was vice chancellor for academic affairs at the Tennessee Regent System in Nashville. And so, I was not in Oklahoma and had to travel some distance to go to those meetings and stuff. So we decided early on, all of us, that we were really going to be committed to consensus building because that was part of our culture. And one of the things that I think people fail to understand when they think about consensus building is it's time consuming. Because if you have one person who, just doesn't want to agree or doesn't want to change their mind or collaborate in some way, you're there a long time convincing that person that they need to think about this the same way you do. And so consensus building is really important, I think, and the opportunity for the tribal colleges to actually use their culture to govern their institutions is what makes them so special in the first place. I think it's a really critical piece of how they work. Now you're going to ask me about Haskell, and Haskell, as you know, early founders were a little unsure about including Haskell as a tribal college because it's not run by a tribe. So it doesn't really meet the definition of tribal colleges like the others, which have authority from their tribe to teach their traditions and to teach their cultures and their language and stuff. So, and it's a federal school. So they have federal union. And in fact, I worked at Haskell at 2 different times. The first time I was director of admissions for 5 years. And then the last position was president for 5 years. And the first time I was there, my sister was on faculty there, and she was actually a national vice president for the federal union. So I've lived in a household where I've been able to look at both sides of the picture and see both sides of the situation, because she and the union really, let me back up and say it this way. Everybody who works in a school will say to you at some point, I'm in it for the kids. But once you drop a union into the situation, the union is not the least bit worried about kids. They're worried about the people who pay their dues. So for someone who's a member of the union to say we're in it for the kids, it's really not true. That's not how it works. And so shared governance and the movement towards shared governance is a very different animal when you drop a union in it. Now, many institutions of higher ed don't have unions and operate under shared governance. And I'm guessing and thinking that realistically, it's more toward what tribal colleges do, which is a shared governance model in the first place. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. In our initial communications, you noted that you believed in situational leadership. Can you explain what that is and how does that differ from or curtail with shared governance?
Well, one of the, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about leadership over the years, and actually have a leadership model that I developed with a colleague of mine that talks about in Indian country leadership being actually 5 domains. So there's leadership that is, like a scholar, somebody who's writing and doing policy and so forth. There's leadership as a role model. Anybody in your tribe can be that, can be a role model. There's just these different pieces of leadership. And then at some point, when you get to the middle of this model, there's one who leads us at all times. Well, the one who leads us at all times is going to lead you through good times and bad times. So for us now, it's, tribes are not at war right now, or I guess some people would characterize it as that, but you know what I mean? We're not fighting each other or shooting at the feds right now. So there's war leadership, and then there's peace leadership. And the person who is a leader has to behave differently in those situations. And so that's what situational leadership really talks about. So in a peacetime, when you have time to make a decision, if you have something that is not critical, something you can debate and something you can spend some time looking at the pros and cons and trying to find consensus with, that's shared leadership. When you have something that, like there's a hole in the roof and, we've got to cancel classes, that's situational leadership too. But we don't have to do shared governance to do that. It's more critical and it's necessary that we take care of that right now. So that's what I meant by situational leadership. There are some situations where it's, you're in charge and they're going to blame you anyway. So you just have to make a decision and hope that you've got enough experience and skills that it's the right decision.
That's interesting. So let's back up a little bit here. You expressed some concerns about faculty participation in governance, especially when unions are involved. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, as I mentioned, my sister was a national vice president for a union, and one of the schools that she represented, the person was a federal employee and worked, like all civil servants from 8 to 5. But this person had decided that, well, nobody was paying that much attention to him. He was at a school and he could just go over to another school fairly close and teach classes and get paid. So he had 2 income streams coming in. Well, of course, somebody ratted him out pretty soon. And so he was dismissed from the school that he was working at. And he filed a complaint and the union had to represent him. So even though she knew that what he was doing was illegal, she and the union had to represent him because if they didn't, he would sue them for non-representation. So it's all a tangled mess when you start putting unions in. I think that in my mind, and I'm a very old woman now, Bradley, the way I was raised, if you were a professional, then you didn't need a union to stand up for you. You stood up for yourself. And when I very first started teaching in public schools, we had a union there and the dues was $1 a year and I wouldn't pay it. I don't believe in unions. I signed a contract. Turned out my best friend, who is still my best friend, had signed a contract for about $5,000 more than me. I didn't know it at the time because it was all a big, in public information. But once I signed that contract, I was obligated to do what I said I would do. And I think that's what professional people do. I don't think doctors have unions and lawyers. I mean, we either are professionals or we aren't, I think. So I choose to be.
Well, when it comes to TCU governance and administration, the big pink elephant in the room oftentimes is tribal politics. And so when our lead writer for this issue, Barbara Ellen Sorensen, was conducting interviews with stakeholders at different TCUs, she encountered considerable reluctance to discuss the role that politics sometimes plays in how an institution is governed. With that in mind, I have 2 questions. First, from your experience, can you elaborate on why this is such a sensitive issue? And secondly, how can TCUs minimize the negative effects that politics play in their governance?
Well, when you said that she ran into some brick walls there, I'm thinking she ran into some brick walls where people didn't want to talk on the record about politics. Because at least in my experience in Indian country, people will pretty much say anything about anything. They just don't want to be quoted. But having said that, politics is an integral part of tribal colleges. They're sanctioned by a tribal government, and that's political. That's a political entity. And one of the concerns I know that people have struggled with over the years is trying to get Higher Learning Commission to understand that relationship from the authority to operate as a tribal college and the college itself. So one of the things that Comanche Nation colleges, we moved and established separate bank accounts. And, if the tribe had a holiday, we didn't necessarily take the holiday. We tried to separate ourselves out, even though we were operating under their authority. And it didn't stop people from doing political things. Now, an interesting thing about the politics in tribal colleges, in my mind, is this business of nepotism. And I think about what a colonized version of our lives we've made ourselves, because, if I talk about nepotism, the first thing you're going to say is, well, that's wrong. You can't hire your relatives, or if you hire your relatives, that must mean that you're a crook of some sort. But when you think about it, traditional societies, way before white contact, relied on their relatives, and they could sanction their relatives in ways that a formal institution would not sanction you. And so I think that that's a stream of thought that needs to be considered, or researched, or talked about with elders, because I think that it's important that we keep these communities targeted to the idea that higher learning is important for our children, and therefore you need to get the best person in the position in that institution that you can get. And if that best person happens to be your uncle or your cousin, and you can't hire them because you have political policies that say you can't, then are you really doing the best for that kid? I don't know. I think I might have got off track there, Bradley.
No, that's a really interesting point you're making, a very enlightening one. And it's so true that nepotism has become, it's kind of like a dirty word when you hear it. And it is sort of a colonized there's so much colonization baggage there.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, that's the whole thing. And I know that you've had conversations with Lionel before, probably even off the record, but he has for years wanted to do their own accrediting agency. And when I was at Haskell, I made sure that Haskell was accredited by WinHEC. Not all of the tribal colleges are, but he saw that as a vision. Let's create our own ways to think about accrediting our institutions, so that Higher Learning Commission doesn't get to dictate to us how we operate. Well, that's all well and good until you get till you kind of keep going up the ladder and figure out that, well, Department of Ed's not going to let students be Pell eligible if you're not Higher Learning accredited. And so then we're like locked into a very colonized, non-traditional sort of thinking that, I don't know how we get out of that. I mean, we just try to make ways as best we can, try to infuse the culture and the language and the traditions as best we can within a tribal college setting.
Yeah. Well, let's finish up here with just one last question. As a longtime leader in American Indian higher education, what advice and wisdom can you offer emerging TCU leaders on this increasingly critical issue of shared governance?
I think from my own experience, one of the actual lessons learned as a tribal college administrator and as an administrator in higher ed is that you need to be a little more thoughtful and reflective about your place. And by that, I mean, I made decisions as a college president at Haskell, none of which do I regret to this day, because it was important to think about the whole context of that decision. So, for example, one of the things, one of the first things I noticed when I went to Haskell was issues in the cafeteria. And here we have a population of students, a general population of American Indians who have high risk of obesity, high incidence of diabetes, high incidence of high blood pressure, heart disease. And yet, if you look at what you're serving in the cafeteria, it's all this processed food and soda. And so the process of changing that meal service to one that was healthier and more nutritious involves some, negotiations with the union, because the employees over there didn't want to change. Now, in the whole scheme of things, you can't come back and say shared governance with faculty. You can't have the faculty saying we're all in it for the kids when they won't make a change for the positive for those kids. So you have to just kind of keep negotiating around that and pulling yourself back to, well, what's the right thing to do here? And how can I make sure that that happens? So while I was there were, after we figured out it was an issue, there were healthy meals. There was a really extended salad bar. We had this $1 million kitchen nobody cooked in. They all microwaved, chicken breasts that were, pre-cooked. Well, guess what? We started cooking again, and we started making things. But that was a major battle. Now, why would that have to be a fight on a college campus? I don't get that part. I mean, that's the part that stumbles over, that I stumble over with shared governance. Because if you start letting people make decisions about things they know nothing about, I mean, if it's shared governance about assessment in the classroom, I get that. If it's shared governance about online teaching, I get that. But if it's shared governance about things that are really outside their expertise, then I don't get it. And so for young people, I think that you need to be careful about how they think about incorporating the opinions of people that they need to rely on. I mean, almost in all of these situations, when you take over as a college president on a reservation, there are plenty of people there who've been there before, and the opportunity to listen to them should not go wasted, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's important what you said there. I mean, it really is. We need to remember all about the students. They come first.
Yeah, you have to walk the talk.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Warner, for joining us, and we wish you the best and hope that you join us again here soon for Current Reflections.
Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to visiting with you again.
All right. Take care.